The grand ballroom of the Langley estate sparkled under the glow of crystal chandeliers, their light refracting into a kaleidoscope of colors across the polished marble floor. Waiters in crisp black suits wove through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes, and hors d'oeuvres as elegant guests mingled beneath gilded arches adorned with fresh roses. It was an evening of opulence, a celebration of wealth, power, and privilege, and Victoria Langley reigned supreme at its center. Victoria stood near the bar, her presence commanding attention without effort. She wore a sleek emerald gown that hugged her figure perfectly, its shimmering fabric catching every ray of light like liquid gold. Her auburn hair cascaded in loose waves over one shoulder, framing a face so striking it bordered on intimidating. At 28, she had mastered the art of poise, her sharp green eyes scanning the room with calculated indifference. To everyone else, she seemed untouchable, and Harris, whose confidence masked a lifetime of entitlement. But tonight, Victoria wasn't just here to dazzle, she was here to win. The circle of elites. Surrounding her were her usual companions, a clique of equally wealthy and vain socialites who thrived on gossip, competition, and trivial bets. They leaned against the velvet banquets, sipping expensive cocktails while dissecting the lives of those around them. Their laughter carried an edge of cruelty, each joke sharper than the last. "Did you see Margaret's dress?" whispered Chloe, a blonde bombshell with a penchant for drama. "It looks like something my grandmother would wear to a funeral." The group erupted in giggles, their voices carrying just loudly enough for Margaret, who stood several feet away, to hear. She turned red but said nothing, retreating further into the shadows of the ballroom. Victoria smirked, though her expression remained coolly detached. These games amused her, watching others squirm under scrutiny, but they rarely challenged her. After all, she had spent years perfecting the delicate balance of charm and disdain required to dominate this world. Tonight, however, fate had other plans. The bet. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted to more daring topics. Someone mentioned a recent scandal involving a celebrity marriage gone wrong, prompting speculation about what made relationships succeed or fail. Predictably, the discussion devolved into mockery. "No one marries for love anymore," declared Charles, a portly banker with a booming voice. "Especially not people like us. We marry for money, status, or convenience. And sometimes because there's simply no other option," added another man, nodding toward Harold Thompson, who sat quietly at a nearby table. Harold, known affectionately or mockingly as Harry, was an anomaly in this glittering sea of excess. He was overweight, unassuming, and dressed in a suit that looked slightly too small for his frame. Yet he bore the brunt of their ridicule with quiet dignity, sipping his drink and pretending not to notice. Flo leaned forward conspiratorially. "Honestly, can you imagine anyone marrying him? Not even out of pity." More laughter followed, cruel and dismissive. Victoria raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the challenge implicit in their words. She prided herself on being fearless, on proving she could do anything if she set her mind to it. And now, faced with the absurdity of their claim, an idea began to form. "Oh, please," she interjected, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You act like it's impossible. I could marry him if I wanted to." Her friends froze mid-laugh, turning to stare at her in disbelief. "You wouldn't dare," Chloe finally managed, her lips curling into a smirk. "Prove it." Victoria hesitated only briefly before shrugging nonchalantly. "Fine. Consider it done." "What's the wager?" asked Charles, clearly delighted by the prospect of entertainment. Victoria tapped her chin thoughtfully before answering. "My diamond necklace, the Cartier one. If I can convince him to marry me within a month, it's mine to keep. If I fail," she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The group erupted in cheers, sealing the bet with clinking glasses. For Victoria, it was a game, a chance to prove once again that she was untouchable, unstoppable. What she didn't realize was that this wager would change her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Meeting Harold. Later that evening, Victoria sought out Harold, cornering him near the dessert table. Up close, he was even less imposing than she'd imagined. His round face was kind, his brown eyes warm behind wire-rimmed glasses. There was a gentleness about him that contrasted sharply with the harshness of the crowd around them. "Hello," she said smoothly, offering a practiced smile. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Victoria Langley." Harold blinked in surprise, clearly unaccustomed to such direct attention from someone like her. "Oh, hello. I'm Harold. Harry, actually. Most people call me Harry." Well, Harry, Victoria continued, leaning slightly closer to create an air of intimacy, I have a proposition for you. He frowned, clearly wary. A proposition? Yes, she gestured vaguely toward the dance floor, where couples swayed to the soft strains of a string quartet. How would you feel about entering into a temporary arrangement? A marriage, to be precise. Harold nearly choked on his champagne. Excuse me? Victoria laughed lightly, brushing off his shock. Don't worry. It's not real. Just a formality. You see, there's a stipulation in my late father's will requiring me to marry before I inherit the remainder of his estate. Naturally, I need someone trustworthy and discreet. She watched as suspicion flickered across his face, followed by curiosity. Why me? He asked finally, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Because you're honest, she replied without hesitation. And because you won't complicate things. Look, I'll make it worth your while. Financially, of course. For a moment, Harry seemed torn between indignation and intrigue. Finally, he sighed, adjusting his glasses nervously. This is insane. But fine. Let's do it. Sealing the deal. By the end of the night, the agreement was settled, or so Victoria believed. She left the gala feeling victorious, already planning how she would break the news to her friends once the sham marriage was official. What she failed to consider was the ripple effect her actions would have, not just on Harry, but on herself. Little did she know, this reckless wager would force her to confront truths she had long ignored. About love, appearances, and the value of seeing beyond the surface. For now, though, she reveled in her perceived triumph, confident that she had won yet another round in the game of life. But as the saying goes, pride often comes before a fall, and Victoria was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The morning after the gala, reality began to set in for both Victoria and Harold. For Victoria, the novelty of her wager had worn off almost immediately, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. She had always prided herself on being untouchable, on controlling every aspect of her life. But now she found herself bound, albeit temporarily, to someone who represented everything she despised about mediocrity. Harold, meanwhile, approached the situation with cautious optimism, hoping that this strange arrangement might lead to something meaningful, or at least teach him something new. Their first day together was a crash course in contrasts. A world apart. Victoria arrived at Harold's modest apartment, a stark departure from the sprawling penthouse suites and luxury estates she was accustomed to, with an air of reluctant curiosity. The building itself was unremarkable, brick walls faded by time, narrow hallways lined with mismatched mailboxes, and a faint smell of cooking spices wafting through the corridors. When Harold opened the door, wearing a threadbare sweater and holding a steaming mug of tea, Victoria couldn't help but wrinkle her nose in distaste. This is where you live? She asked bluntly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Harold chuckled nervously, clearly aware of the judgment in her tone. It's not much, but it suits me, he replied, closing the door behind her. I'd like it here. It's quiet. Quiet wasn't the word Victoria would have used. Cramped, cluttered, and utterly devoid of glamour were more accurate descriptors. Books lined every available surface, stacks on shelves, piles on tables, even towers on the floor. A small television sat perched precariously atop a wobbly dresser, its screen dusty and unused. The kitchen was tidy but outdated, with peeling linoleum tiles and appliances that looked older than Victoria herself. She crossed her arms, surveying the space with thinly veiled disdain. Well, I suppose we'll need to make some adjustments if we're going to pull this off convincingly. Harold raised an eyebrow, unsure whether she was joking or serious. Adjustments? Yes, Victoria said firmly. People will expect us to present a united front. That means no more. This. She gestured vaguely at his surroundings, as if dismissing them entirely. We'll have to upgrade your wardrobe, redecorate, maybe even rent a nicer place while this lasts. Harold blinked, taken aback by her audacity. You realize this isn't permanent, right? It's just for show. Exactly, Victoria countered, her voice sharp. And the better the show, the easier it will be to convince everyone, including my friends, that this is real. Harold sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He hadn't agreed to this charade, expecting it to turn into a full-blown production. But arguing with Victoria seemed futile. Instead, he nodded reluctantly. Fine, whatever you say. Living together. Over the next few days, Victoria settled into Harold's apartment with all the subtlety of a hurricane. She brought suitcases filled with designer clothing, cosmetics, and skincare products. commandeering half of the tiny closet and most of the bathroom counter. Her presence disrupted the peaceful rhythm of Harold's daily life, forcing him to adapt to her fast-paced, high-maintenance routine. Breakfast became a battleground. Harold preferred simple meals, scrambled eggs, toast, maybe a cup of coffee, but Victoria demanded avocado toast, fresh fruit, and organic smoothies. One morning, when Harold served her plain oatmeal instead of the elaborate breakfast she'd requested, she snapped. "I can't eat this," she declared, pushing the bowl away with a scowl. "Do you even know what goes into a proper meal?" Harold clenched his jaw, biting back a retort. "I'm sorry," he said evenly. "I'll try harder tomorrow." But it wasn't just food that caused friction. Victoria criticized nearly everything Harold did, from the way he dressed. Looser shirts, hairy, they don't clean as much, to the way he spoke. Try to sound more confident, it'll sell the act. At first, Harold took her comments in stride, reminding himself that this was temporary. But as the days passed, her constant nitpicking began to wear on him. Moments of kindness. Despite their differences, there were glimpses of humanity beneath Victoria's polished exterior. Late one evening, as Harold worked on repairing a pair of her favorite heels that had broken during a photo shoot, she caught him mid-task. "What are you doing?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. "Fixing your shoes," he replied matter-of-factly. "They're too nice to throw away." Victoria hesitated, watching as he carefully stitched the torn strap back into place. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, her tone softer than usual. "It's no trouble," Harold said with a shrug. "I like fixing things. Makes me feel useful." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, almost instinctively, Victoria moved closer, sitting down beside him. "Thank you," she said quietly, surprising them both. Harold smiled, rushing off her gratitude. "Any time." These small moments of connection hinted at the possibility of something deeper, but Victoria quickly retreated behind her armor whenever emotions threatened to surface. To her, vulnerability was weakness, and she refused to let anyone see her falter. The growing divide. As the weeks went by, the strain of maintaining their facade grew increasingly apparent. Victoria threw herself into planning social events and public appearances, determined to prove to her friends that her marriage was legitimate. She dragged Harold to charity galas, art exhibitions, and exclusive parties, coaching him endlessly on how to behave. "You're slouching again," she hissed under her breath during one such event. "Stand up straight." "I'm trying," Harold whispered back, his cheeks flushing red. "But these shoes are killing me." Victoria rolled her eyes, exasperated. "Then buy better ones. Honestly, Harry, you're making this harder than it needs to be." Her words stung, though Harold tried not to let them show. Beneath his calm demeanor, frustration simmered. He had agreed to this arrangement out of kindness, believing it wouldn't cost him anything beyond a little inconvenience. But the longer it went on, the more he realized how much of himself he was sacrificing to keep Victoria happy. Tension builds. One particularly tense evening, after returning home from yet another exhausting outing, Victoria collapsed onto the couch, kicking off her heels with a groan. "I hate this," she muttered, massaging her temples. "Why does everyone have to scrutinize us so much?" Harold, who had been quietly reading in the corner, glanced up from his book. "Maybe because they know this isn't real." His comment hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Victoria stared at him, her expression unreadable. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Harold said slowly, setting aside his book, "that no matter how hard we pretend, people aren't stupid. They can see through the act, Victoria. And the more you push, the less believable it becomes." She bristled, defensive. "Are you saying this is my fault?" "No," Harold replied, his voice steady. "But maybe it's time to ask yourself why you're doing this. Is it really about winning a bet, or is there something else driving you?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, unable to articulate an answer. For the first time since the wager began, she felt genuinely unsettled, not by Harold's words, but by the questions they raised. Foreshadowing change. That night, as Harold drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting between them. Victoria's armor, once impenetrable, was beginning to crack. Whether she realized it or not, their forced proximity was forcing her to confront parts of herself she'd rather ignore. For Victoria, lying awake in the dark, the weight of Harold's question pressed heavily on her mind. Why had she made this bet? Was it truly about proving the point, or was it something deeper, something she hadn't dared to admit even to herself? Whatever the reason, one thing was certain: their journey was far from over, and as the lines between pretense and reality blurred, neither of them could predict where it might lead. The weeks following their tense exchange at home marked a subtle but significant shift in Victoria and Harold's dynamic. While outwardly they continued to maintain the charade of a happy marriage, cracks began to form in Victoria's carefully constructed facade. For the first time in her life, she found herself questioning not only the bet that had brought them together, but also the values she had always held dear. A new perspective. One evening, after attending yet another high society gala, Victoria returned home exhausted and irritable. The event had been particularly grueling. Her friends had scrutinized every detail of her relationship with Harold, peppering her with intrusive questions and thinly veiled skepticism. Despite her best efforts to appear confident, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control, not just of the situation, but of herself. As she slipped off her heels and sank onto the couch, Harold emerged from the kitchen carrying two steaming mugs of tea. He offered her one wordlessly, his expression gentle and unassuming. "Thanks," Victoria muttered, accepting the mug without meeting his eyes. She took a sip, savoring the warmth as it spread through her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Harold broke the silence. "Rough night?" Victoria sighed, setting the mug down on the coffee table. "You could say that. Everyone acted like we were some kind of circus act, staring, whispering, judging." Harold nodded sympathetically. "I noticed, but you handled it well." She shot him a skeptical look. "Did I?" "Because it felt like I was drowning." He smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe, but drowning isn't always bad. It forces you to learn how to swim." His words caught her off guard, simple yet profound. Victoria studied him for a moment, noticing the quiet strength in his demeanor, the way he carried himself with dignity despite the ridicule he endured daily. It occurred to her then that Harold possessed qualities she rarely encountered in her world: humility, patience, and resilience. Qualities she had dismissed, or worse, mocked, because they didn't align with her narrow definition of success. For the first time, Victoria allowed herself to wonder, what if she had been wrong about him? About everything? Defending Harold. The next day, Victoria accompanied Harold to a small bookstore where he volunteered once a week. She had insisted on tagging along, claiming it would be good PR for their marriage. In truth, she was curious about the man behind the awkward exterior, the man who seemed so content living a life devoid of luxury and excess. The bookstore was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, its windows adorned with hand-painted signs advertising local authors and poetry readings. Inside, shelves sagged under the weight of countless books, their spines worn and faded from years of use. A group of children sat cross-legged on the floor, listening intently as Harold read aloud from a picture book. His voice was warm and animated, drawing smiles from even the shyest listeners. Victoria watched from the doorway, momentarily transfixed. There was a tenderness in Harold's interactions, a genuine affection for the people around him, that she had never seen before. It was humbling, almost disorienting, to witness someone so comfortable in their own skin. Later, as they walked back to the car, Victoria hesitated before speaking. "You're really good with kids," she observed, her tone softer than usual. Harold chuckled, clearly surprised by the compliment. "I guess I've always liked storytelling. Makes the world feel a little less lonely." She nodded thoughtfully, unsure how to respond. For reasons she couldn't quite articulate, his words lingered in her mind long after they returned home. That evening, Victoria attended another gathering with her elite circle of friends. As usual, the conversation turned catty, with everyone eager to gossip about the latest scandals and misfortunes. When Harold's name came up, Victoria braced herself for the inevitable mockery. But what happened next shocked even her. "He's still around," Chloe sneered, swirling her martini glass lazily. "Honestly, Vic, I thought you'd have dumped him by now. He's such a loser." Victoria froze, her grip tightening on her champagne flute. Normally she would have joined in, laughing along with the rest of them. But tonight, something inside her snapped. "Don't talk about him like that," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her in disbelief. Philip blinked, clearly taken aback. "What did you just say?" "I said," Victoria repeated, her tone icy, "don't talk about him like that. Harry is 10 times the person any of you will ever be. He's kind, smart, and genuinely cares about others, qualities none of you seem capable of understanding." Her outburst stunned the group into silence. No one dared to challenge her further, though several exchanged uneasy glances. As Victoria excused herself and left the party early, she felt a strange mix of exhilaration and guilt. She had defended Harold, not because of the bet, but because she believed what she had said, and that realization terrified her. Discovering the truth. Back at home, Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and retreated to the balcony, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. How had she let things get this complicated? What started as a reckless wager was now forcing her to confront truths she had spent years avoiding. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of rustling paper. Glancing over, she spotted an envelope lying on the dining table, addressed to Harold in bold handwriting. Curiosity got the better of her, and she picked it up, scanning its contents quickly. It was a note from one of her friends, a smug reminder of the bet, detailing the terms and mocking Harold's role in the scheme. The final line struck her like a punch to the gut. Can't wait to see his face when he finds out. Victoria's heart sank as the full weight of her betrayal hit her. Harold had trusted her, welcomed her into his life, and treated her with nothing but kindness. And she had used him for a game. Worse still, he was about to discover the truth. Panic set in as she debated whether to tell him or destroy the evidence. Before she could decide, Harold walked in, his expression unreadable as he held up a crumpled piece of paper. "I found this in my jacket pocket," he said quietly, his voice laced with hurt. "Care to explain?" Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, tears welled in her eyes, betraying the turmoil within. For the first time in her life, she felt truly ashamed. An honest conversation. Harold listened silently as Victoria confessed everything. The bet, the lies, her initial disdain for him. To his credit, he didn't interrupt or lash out. When she finished, her voice trembling with emotion, he simply stared at her for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked finally, his tone neutral. "Because I owe you the truth," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And because I don't want to lose you." Harold sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Do you realize how much this hurts? Not just the betrayal, but knowing that our entire relationship has been built on a lie." Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, and I'll understand if you hate me. But please believe me when I say I never meant for things to go this far." To her surprise, Harold didn't react with anger. Instead, he offered her a sad smile. "You know, Victoria, I agreed to this because I thought it might teach me something about courage, about stepping outside my comfort zone. Turns out it taught me more than I bargained for." "What do you mean?" she asked hesitantly. "That sometimes the people we judge most harshly are the ones who need compassion the most," he said softly. "And that love isn't about appearances. It's about seeing someone for who they really are." His words left her speechless. For all her wealth and privilege, Victoria suddenly felt profoundly inadequate compared to the man standing before her. A decision made. By the end of the night, Harold had made up his mind. "I think it's best if I leave for a while," he said gently. "We both need time to figure out what we want, and whether this is something worth fighting for." Victoria wanted to protest, to beg him to stay, but she knew he was right. All she could do was nod, watching helplessly as he packed a small bag and walked out the door. As the apartment fell silent, Victoria collapsed onto the couch, overwhelmed by regret. She had entered into this arrangement seeking victory, but instead she had found something far more valuable, a glimpse of the person she could become, if only she had the courage to change. The days following Harold's departure were among the loneliest Victoria had ever experienced. For someone who thrived on control and perfection, the emptiness of her apartment and her heart was unbearable. She spent hours replaying their conversations in her mind, dissecting every moment she had taken him for granted or dismissed his kindness. The realization that she had driven away one of the few people who truly saw her for who she was gnawed at her relentlessly. But regret, no matter how profound, wasn't enough. If Victoria wanted to win back Harold's trust, and perhaps even his love, she would need to do more than apologize. She would need to change. Victoria's transformation. Determined to prove her sincerity, Victoria began by confronting the shallow values that had defined her life. She started small, donating extravagant items she no longer needed, designer dresses, jewelry, handbags, all symbols of the materialism she now despised. Her friends noticed immediately, bombarding her with questions about why she was throwing away perfectly good possessions. "I don't need them anymore," she replied simply, refusing to elaborate. The truth was, she didn't want to be the person who measured worth by wealth or appearances. Not anymore. Next, Victoria sought out opportunities to connect with others in meaningful ways. Inspired by Harold's volunteer work, she began spending time at local shelters and community centers, helping serve meals and organize book drives. At first, the experience felt foreign, awkward, even, but over time she discovered a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. Listening to people share their stories reminded her that everyone carries burdens invisible to the outside world, including herself. Her greatest challenge, however, came when she decided to confront her own arrogance. For years, Victoria had prided herself on being untouchable, using sarcasm and superiority as shields against vulnerability. Now, she forced herself to open up, to admit fault, to ask for forgiveness, and to embrace imperfection. It wasn't easy. Humility required strength she hadn't realized she lacked. But with each step forward, she felt herself shedding the armor that had kept her isolated for so long. One evening, while volunteering at a library reading program, Victoria spotted a familiar face among the children gathered around the storyteller. It was Harold, animated and cheerful as always, captivating his audience with tales of adventure and wonder. Her breath caught in her throat. Seeing him again stirred emotions she had tried to bury: longing, guilt, hope. After the session ended, Victoria approached him cautiously, unsure whether he would welcome her presence. "Hi, Harry," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you have a minute?" Harold looked up, surprised but not unkind. "Victoria," he acknowledged, setting down the book he'd been holding. "What are you doing here?" I wanted to see you," she admitted, her cheeks flushing red. To apologize properly. Again, he studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded toward an empty bench nearby. "Let's talk." An honest reckoning. They sat side by side, the silence between them heavy yet charged with possibility. Victoria took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "and I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it if I don't try to make things right." Harold listened quietly, allowing her to continue without interruption. She told him about her efforts to change: the donations, the volunteering, the introspection. She confessed how much she admired his kindness and humility, qualities she had once mocked but now deeply respected. And finally, she admitted the hardest truth of all, that she had fallen in love with him, not because of what he represented, but because of who he truly was. When she finished, tears streaming down her face, Harold exhaled slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Why should I believe you?" he asked gently. "How do I know this isn't just another act?" Victoria flinched, the question cutting deeper than any accusation. "Because I'm willing to fight for us," she replied earnestly. "Not for show, not for a bet, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." For a long moment, Harold didn't respond. Then, with a faint smile, he reached out and took her hand. "You've got a lot to prove," he said, his tone warm but firm. "But I'm willing to give you a chance, if you're serious about changing." Relief washed over Victoria, followed by determination. She squeezed his hand tightly, nodding. "I am, more than anything." Harold's growth. While Victoria worked on transforming herself, Harold embarked on his own journey of self-discovery. His decision to leave hadn't been made lightly. It was born out of pain, yes, but also a desire to understand his own worth beyond the ridicule he had endured for years. During his time apart, Harold threw himself into creative pursuits he had long neglected. He began writing, a mix of poetry and short stories inspired by his experiences with Victoria and the lessons he had learned along the way. To his surprise, his words resonated with others, earning praise from friends and strangers alike. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream of a future where he wasn't defined by his weight or his quiet demeanor, but by the depth of his character. He'd also reconnected with old passions, joining a local hiking group and rediscovering the joy of exploring nature. The physical activity helped boost his confidence, reminding him that strength came in many forms, not just outward appearance. Slowly but surely, Harold began to see himself through kinder eyes, embracing the parts of him that made him unique. When Victoria re-entered his life, Harold found himself torn between caution and hope. Could he forgive her? More importantly, could he trust her? In the end, it was her vulnerability that convinced him to take a leap of faith. If she was willing to strip away the layers of pretense and reveal her true self, then perhaps they both deserved a second chance. Rebuilding trust. Their reconciliation didn't happen overnight. Both Victoria and Harold knew that rebuilding trust required patience, effort, and unwavering honesty. They started by setting boundaries, agreeing to communicate openly about their feelings and expectations. Small gestures became milestones, shared meals, quiet evenings reading together, laughter over inside jokes. Victoria continued volunteering alongside Harold, finding joy in working toward a common goal. Together, they organized fundraisers for literacy programs, combining her organizational skills with his passion for storytelling. Their partnership flourished not because it was perfect, but because it was real. One afternoon, as they walked hand in hand through the park, Harold turned to Victoria with a playful grin. "So does this mean we're officially giving this another shot?" She smiled, squeezing his hand affectionately. "Only if you promise to keep fixing my shoes." He laughed, pulling her closer. "Deal. A new beginning." By the time summer arrived, Victoria and Harold had transformed not only themselves but also their relationship. Gone were the pretenses and insecurities that had once defined them. In their place stood two individuals who had faced their flaws head on and emerged stronger for it. As they stood together under the golden light of a setting sun, Victoria felt a profound sense of gratitude for Harold's forgiveness, for the lessons she had learned, and for the love they had fought so hard to rebuild. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and uncertainty, but for the first time in her life, she welcomed them not as obstacles, but as opportunities to grow. And as Harold wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close, she realized something else. That true beauty lies not in appearances, but in the connections we nurture and the hearts we choose to open. The autumn air carried a crispness that signaled the end of summer and the beginning of new beginnings. For Victoria and Harold, it marked not only a season of change, but also a profound shift in their lives, one rooted in forgiveness, understanding, and unconditional love. What had started as a reckless wager had evolved into something neither of them could have anticipated, a genuine connection that transcended appearances and societal expectations. A second chance at love. Months after their reconciliation, Victoria and Harold decided to renew their vows, not for show, but as a symbol of their commitment to each other and the life they were building together. The ceremony was intimate, held in a quaint garden surrounded by golden leaves and soft sunlight. Friends from both their worlds attended, mingling awkwardly at first, but eventually finding common ground over shared laughter and heartfelt speeches. Victoria wore a simple ivory dress, its elegance understated yet radiant. Gone were the flashy gowns and diamond-studded accessories. Instead, she adorned herself with a single strand of pearls Harold had gifted her during one of their quiet evenings together. Beside her, Harold stood tall, his confidence shining brighter than any suit or tie ever could. He had lost weight, not out of vanity, but because he felt healthier and more alive. But his most striking feature remained unchanged: the warmth in his eyes and the kindness in his smile. As they exchanged vows, their words resonated deeply with everyone present, and especially with each other. "Harold," Victoria began, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "When I first met you, I judged you based on what I thought mattered most: wealth, status, appearance. But you showed me that none of those things define a person. You taught me the value of humility, patience, and seeing beyond the surface. Because of you, I've become someone I'm proud of. And because of you, I know what real love looks like." Harold smiled, his gaze soft and unwavering. "Victoria, when we started this journey, I didn't expect much. I thought it would be temporary, a brief detour in our lives. Instead, it became the turning point that changed everything. You challenged me to step outside my comfort zone, to embrace who I am without apology. And even when I walked away, you fought for us, not for pride or obligation, but because you cared. That's why I'll always choose you, because you see me, truly see me, and love me anyway." Their promises weren't just declarations of devotion. They were acknowledgments of how far they'd come individually and as a couple. They weren't perfect, nor did they claim to be, but they were committed to growing together, flaws and all. Letting go of the past. After the ceremony, Victoria made a symbolic gesture that left no doubt about her transformation. She handed her Cartier diamond necklace, the very one she had wagered months ago, to the event organizer, instructing her to auction it off for charity. "What are you doing?" Harold asked later, raising an eyebrow as they danced under twinkling fairy lights. "I don't need it anymore," Victoria replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "It represents a part of my life I'm ready to leave behind. Besides, there are better ways to spend money, like helping people who actually need it."